Before you start listening to today's episode of In This Body, the podcast, I wanted to let you know that today's episode explicitly references the use of plant medicine, ayahuasca, and psychedelics. It should be noted that plant medicine, ayahuasca, and other psychedelics can have serious risks and should only be undertaken with the appropriate guidance. The legality of these substances varies by location, so ensure that you comply with the legalities that surround you. Welcome to In This Body, a podcast where we dive deep into the potent power of embodiment. I'm your host, Ailey Jolie, a psychotherapist deeply passionate about living life fully from the wisdom within your very own body. The podcast In This Body is a love letter to embodiment, a podcast dedicated to asking important questions like, how does connecting to your body change your life? How does connecting to your body enhance your capacity to love more deeply and live more authentically? And how can collective embodiment alter the course of our shared world? Join me for consciously curated conversations with leading experts. Each episode is intended to support you in reconnecting to your very own body. This podcast will be available for free wherever you get your podcasts, making it easy for you to stay connected to In This Body, the podcast with me, Ailey Jolie. Welcome to today's episode of In This Body. I'm thrilled to have Angela Cara back with us today. Angela is the Clinical Director of Wise Body Counselling in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. She is a Registered Clinical Counsellor holding a master's degree in Counselling Psychology. Today, Angela joins us to explore her work in the psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy realm at Therapeutic. I previously worked in the realm of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, not at Therapeutic, and I rarely speak about this time in my personal and professional life. However, since this is an area of connection between Angela and me, and because I believe psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy has significant implications for embodiment, both positive and negative, I'll be sharing some of my own professional and personal experiences today as well. What is much more interesting than my experiences in this episode is hearing Angela discuss how she became the first therapist in Canada to support a client under a Schedule 56 exemption. A Schedule 56 exemption in Canada legally authorizes the use of psilocybin for psychotherapeutic purposes. She did this with her mentor. Angela has supported clients facing terminal illnesses, helping them navigate the existential anxieties and emotional turmoil that can intensify towards life's end. Additionally, she has gone on to train new therapists in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy at Therapeutic. In this episode, we'll also dive into how Angela integrates somatics and psychedelics into her therapy work. In this episode, we'll also dive into how Angela's psychedelic experiences and professional training changes how she works as a somatic psychotherapist. We'll also share more about our experiences in the psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy space, discussing how these therapies can both connect and disconnect you from your body and the implications they can have on your mental health. I am so keen for you to be here and hear more from Angela. Angela, welcome back to In This Body, the podcast hosted by me, Ailey Jolie. So my first question for you that I would love to hear is what initially drew you to the realm of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy?
Yeah. In 2012, I handed in my thesis on my meditation experience, and I went to a meditation retreat. And at the end of that retreat, I actually had an opportunity with one of those teachers to sit an ayahuasca journey. So at that time, I didn't even exactly know what ayahuasca was. I had kind of seen it in my master's program through some videos that were around Gabor Mate's work and more like addictions work. And I'm kind of someone who tends to dive in. So I just dove in and discovered what it was in the process. So that was kind of interesting because then I returned back, and I had told you in the last call how I had that teacher, Anna Mosel, who was really impactful in my master's program. And I was lucky to have her there because she had also been my thesis advisor. And I checked in with her when I got home, and she said, if I was you, I might, take a couple years to just do ordinary things. And that's what sort of happened. I came back, I decided, you know what, I'm going to move back to my home city. I came back, I worked on an organic farm, and I also worked I started volunteering at BC Families in Transition, where I met Bruce Tobin. So it was actually while I was sort of in a stage of grounding and starting to integrate, you know, how I want to do my therapy work, that I was introduced to Bruce, and that started kind of a friendship and almost a mentorship, I would say, around, breath work at that time, and then ultimately psilocybin work.
For those of us who don't know who Bruce is or what you are referring to, could you give us some information about who Bruce is? I know who you're speaking to, but he
Yeah.
probably deserves his own introduction.
Absolutely. And there's like so much I could say as far as introducing him. He's such a lovely human and he's done so much. But I would say the main thing that, in regards to what we're talking about here, he was a psychotherapist and art therapy professor at UVic for about 30 years, and also had his private practice where he did a lot of dream work and art therapy. And why he's known around the psilocybin work is because he was a big advocate for originally the Section 56 exemptions, which were they were sort of the opportunity for an individual to say to the health minister, at the time it was Patty Hajdu, and they would say to the health minister, look, I've tried other things. I'm in this place where I have a terminal diagnosis, or essentially like a very serious diagnosis that could be terminal. And they said, I believe that I have this right to, there's this exemption where you can say, it's in the best public interest for me to be able to try other things that have scientific basis, but haven't yet been, they wouldn't otherwise fit with our Controlled Substance Act. So it gave them an exemption from the Controlled Substance Act, which allowed them to have an experience where they could sit a high dose, they could be journeying in a high dose journey with therapists present. And that's how Bruce has kind of gotten his name around the therapy world.
So, for simplicity, so people know and they can follow, Bruce was one of the first people in the psychedelic space who actually allowed the public to petition for access with Schedule 56 exemptions. And he just so happened to be kind of your first mentor.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I would say he was definitely a mentor at that time. At the beginning, when I was 27, meeting him at the BC Families in Transition, it was more learning therapy and art therapy. And then years later, starting to practice breath work, and then ultimately moving into the psychedelic world. And I got to sit two of the first Section 56 exemptions in Canada.
Mhm. I'm curious to hear about how psychedelic experiences in your own life or sitting those psilocybin journeys with other people have maybe changed how you practice as a somatic therapist.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, there's a few things. One was that realization around how when people have these openings, you see, you actually start to kind of form your therapeutic perspective and your map, because you're sitting with such big openings in those very first experiences where people were really facing the end of their life, and they were very kind of wanting, like gung-ho, wanting to dive right in and do the really deep emotional work. That helped me to almost work backwards from there. And it's shaped how I see therapy, because I think there were probably points where I was more on the careful side in therapy of wanting to, it was almost like sometimes I think when you're a newer therapist, you have almost a misunderstanding of the Rogerian approach and think, I should never trigger someone, I should never, confront them. And then ultimately seeing the power of people doing that deep emotional work and actually realizing, oh, okay, so this is what we're doing in little hour-long sections, and in that hour-long container, are there ways that I could be more inviting of emotions and yeah, like those deeper kind of needs that people have that are often under the surface, can I allow them to come forward more and to be held?
What did you not know about psychedelics before you started sitting those journeys?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think the number one thing was I was quite surprised how intense the work was, how exhausting it was. It could kind of feel like being hit by a train or something because of those many hours of emotions that you're being a part in. You can't not feel them. You're holding that space. And so it kind of that work kind of taught me that there's there's something so powerful in that, and that doing something like that, being a sitter for these really big energies, even the beautiful, blissful energies, even the powerful kind of, yeah, like the transpersonal experiences people experience, it can take so much, both for the journeyer, of course, even more so, but even for the sitter, it can be really something that it almost feels like it's draining you on some deep level, like draining your soul energy, even though it feels so good to be a part of. So it made me realize that self-care was a massive, massive part of that kind
Mhm.
of work.
Yeah, at one point I had done some presenting in different psychedelic conferences about the difference between self-care for a psychotherapist and self-care for a psychedelic-assisted psychotherapist, and how vastly different that is,
Yeah.
just based from really how much the body is involved in those sessions, which leads me to my next question for you is, how do you see psychedelics, or specifically psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy, enhancing the connection between mind and body?
Yeah, I love that question. Well, it's really like been so powerful to connect in with people and see where they might know intellectually. I think I spoke about that last time, that cognitively they might know, okay, I have something. They might not call it pain at that point, but they kind of know, like, yeah, there's something underneath the surface that even when I meditate, or even when sometimes people are saying, like, even when I've been doing years of psychotherapy, I haven't quite been able to crack into that. And for me, it's been so powerful to see, for example, one of those Section 56 exemptions. um, the woman was she was journeying with that fear of existential, um, like fear, right? That fear of, like, the reality of an end, like having a terminal diagnosis and death. And so at the end of her journey, she went through so much. I didn't know if she was going to sit up and say, like, oh my gosh, like, I'll never do that again. That was a terrible idea, because she went through so many feelings, like so much anger, so much pain, so much grief. And at the end, she sat up and said, well, I'm not afraid to die. And that had been a massive shift for her. And it was so powerful to witness that, and to, in a way, it's a real honor, because you feel like you walk away with, like, a full heart, and a sense that, okay, this work is different, and it can provide something that, yeah, when then integrated in a grounded way, can be so healing for people in the long term.
With that maybe client that you're speaking of there, how did you perceive the mind and body connecting in that session? Did you have any idea what was going on? Did she describe it after?
Yeah. Yeah, she didn't describe it at the time. So on the journey, and we do a lot of preparation with people to prepare them that this isn't a typical kind of therapy session. You're not going to be likely talking. I mean, you might, like, there's no rule not to say anything, but it's more that we continue to encourage people into that internalized format, even in the preparation, through, like, more reflective art and questions. And the thing is that on that journey, you don't have to say words, because in a way you realize that words are too, they wouldn't be able to capture it. They're, like, too simple. They're too basic to capture what's kind of going on in those inner experiences. So really, you feel it, and you feel that it's emotional, and that it's this likely very kind of uncharted territory that people are going into in themselves, and it's naturally very embodied, because people have prepared for that, and understand that, yeah, this is about feeling what needs to be felt, and what I'm already carrying with me.
How do you see people maybe potentially more embodied after these sessions?
Yeah, so absolutely. So one thing is that first of all, the kind of side note is that, you know, I've been passionate for years about the topic of spiritual bypassing and how psychedelic work can bring up that, opportunity for that split because of the fact that you have this very large experience and realize, wow, I'm like so much more than, what I thought I was. But that larger kind of expanse of your being can be a lot for the personality to kind of integrate. So on one hand, I will say that I won't say psychedelics in general are always embodied. Yeah, you can see examples at festivals or whatnot of a different, and not to say that recreational therapy is always an issue or anything. People can have insight with recreational psychedelic use, but uh, the only way it's kind of guaranteed, it's more like consistently known to be effective, is in the context of a therapeutic interpersonal relationship. And so in that process, in the integration, people are often speaking to what came up, even in those moments where they were like terrified, for example, and then they reached out a hand and I would hold somebody's hand firmly and just let them, take their hand back when they're ready. And I wouldn't know exactly, what they're journeying through. You don't obviously see what they're seeing, but you feel that something is happening. And often in the integration, you find out, wow, they actually were going to such a deep place that they say something like, later they'll say, it was like that handhold, it's like that care that you were giving me. I could feel it and it was going back into all these different memories. It's like it somehow it sounds almost magical, but it's like it somehow yeah, provides this support and companionship or presence to, or love, like therapeutic love, to those places where there was aloneness and fear and abandonment. And
Do
so, yeah.
you have any ideas as to why the kind of physical and also psychological holding that happens in those sessions does kind of ripple back through time in that way?
Well, I like I kind of like the idea there's I can almost speak to maybe the two different theories that I'm a big fan of. One is more the psychodynamic approach, where you kind of see that there's that the way the psyche works is that when there was something painful and the person felt overwhelmed, and I'll say, by the way, too, a lot of my clients come in saying like, I don't have trauma, and it's like I have a lot of like love in my heart for people don't who don't think they have trauma, but then as we do the work, find out, oh, there there are all these like layers of, yeah, like moments of aloneness and overwhelm that we somehow put aside. So from the psychodynamic perspective, that putting aside is kind of like, it might be even more than that, it might be considered repression. So it's like put underground and we're still carrying it in our body, maybe as tension. And then it's like on a journey that, if you can picture like a curtain that's between your conscious and unconscious mind, it's like it opens on a high dose journey. It's like it opens 100%. So everything is coming through into your awareness. That could be memories. It's not always memories. It could be just sensation in the body, especially if it's very young stuff. But yeah, going through those perceptual changes makes people realize that, oh, okay, so there are things that go on, whether we call it repression, like in a psychodynamic way, or in the focusing way, they might see it more as like, yeah, it got like contained or sealed up in a certain way,
Yeah.
but it's with us. So there are kind of different ways to word it or to frame it. But either way, it's like an opening to what's yeah, what's unresolved.
How do you support someone when they have those body-based sensations? Because oftentimes a lot of people that are drawn to psychedelic assisted psychotherapy are quite shut down, quite numb. There is trauma oftentimes there that's led them to be disconnected. And taking a psychedelic can be a very embodied, very sensation oriented experience. And as someone who has been there with people, I'm curious how you help them through really coming into contact with the body, even if that doesn't get integrated in after, there is still those sensations in that moment, those moments of deep connection.
Yeah, exactly. So there's kind of the different, ways, like when I'm in preparation, I'm thinking of the different things that I'm wanting, my intention for our prep is, number one, to build trust between us. So that's kind of a two-way street in many ways, that I also want to trust that they're revealing everything, because there are things that we consider sort of like like you know uh, if somebody has psychosis, like a history of psychosis, or family members, or even secondary family members, that's likely going to be sort of like a flag for the work, and that
Mhm.
person might be better suited for art therapy or focusing type work from my perspective. But there's also like this piece where when people have trauma, you have to sometimes slow the whole thing down, because people will sometimes know that they have trauma, and maybe they've done some work, but they'll be so eager. They come in kind of being like, yeah, I want to do this. I want to, like go deep. And in a way, part of the work is to slow it all down and say, well, you know what, this might not be 3 preparation sessions as we might see in the research. This might be us getting to know each other a bit over time, because of that trust. Like from my perspective, the kind of relationship that is developed between the therapist and the client is part of the picture. And so it's kind of like, we want to slow this down so that, yes, I'm gaining information. I'm also doing some psychoed about what the journey entails, but I'm also checking to see how, what's coming up between us, because that can be a part of what we want to look at and
Mhm.
work through. So I would say that's part of it. And then the other part is, yeah, to start helping people, assisting people to get more in touch with those body sensations long before the encounter day. So helping people to, even something like art therapy or dream work is a beginning point to getting in touch with those internal images. And you're getting an idea before the journey what's going on inside, from dream work. Even though people might come in and say, I don't have any dreams, once they start to be open to it, they'll say, oh yeah, no, I do, I just don't like my dreams, or I only remember a snippet. But the more they get in touch with that, we're already starting to get an idea of what's kind of unresolved inside. And that can be really helpful with PTSD, because then we have a kind of idea of what might come up, and that'll be really important for us to know how to work with that.
When you think of the field of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, like broad scale, do you feel like it does connect people more to their bodies? Or are you more, yes, no? I know for myself, I had a period where I definitely really fully believed it connected me to my body. And I think I had a few true sessions of that. And then I think I had a lot of sessions where I just totally bypassed everything.
Yeah.
And I think the difference between those sessions is actually the integration and the level of embodiment the practitioner had. And I would love to hear from you about the differences between those two, because maybe you have that personal experience, maybe you have that professional experience of actually being in the room with how different it can be when someone actually goes in and they feel the stuff, and when someone goes in and they feel some stuff, but it's not necessarily the material that's causing them pain or suffering.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So there's a couple different things that come to mind with that. One is that, just as people can say, I sat meditation for years and I didn't, touch the core of the pain until a psychedelic experience, the other can kind of be true in a way too, which I've seen in reverse, where you have someone who has maybe done a lot of ayahuasca journeys, and they've said, yeah, like I'm like they've got a lot of images to work with. And I mentioned that example of myself, where experiencing that journey in 2012, and then having a mentor at that time say, you've probably got many years of like material to integrate. I was so glad she said that and gave that advice, because there's this piece where we sometimes think it's about the opening, and you keep trying to get that back through psychedelics, because you've had sometimes such an amazing, like, touched into bliss or joy or love like you've never felt before. um, but what ends up happening sometimes is people do skip over those more maybe subtle even pain points. And for myself, when I then went to Peru in 2015, And by the end of that 2 weeks, it's like I had sat 9 ayahuasca journeys, and I had never had any autobiographical imagery come up, no memory, like really nothing about my own life or my own, yeah, kind of personal attachment work or anything like that. So on one level, I say what's interesting for me around that is that part of my thing would not have been able to be worked through in a group setting with ayahuasca, because the thing I discovered was that my very thing I needed to work on in one-on-one therapy. I've been working with a Jungian therapist and really get so much from that. And I realized what it was that my very pattern was, you can call it Atlas. I found the myth Atlas to be really helpful, because he really put all the problems of the world on his shoulders. So in a journey, how that shows up is that I would be able to sense into everyone else in the room for hours on end. I'd be even like, we'd explore what image. It sounds wild, but you'd explore what image that person had, and you'd say, yeah, and then this happened, and you'd actually be sort of like losing the boundary of your personhood completely, which again, normally that does happen on psychedelics. But for those of us who are maybe more sensitive to being uh to sensing the other person's experience, and not being as clear in our own kind of needs and our own like the depth of our own psyche, it's like it was just a pattern that I found it wouldn't have been able to be really worked through in that setting, because it was like I didn't know how to do it. I was even sitting with a long-term Buddhist practitioner, and she was teaching us, all the loving kindness prior to the sessions, prior to the journeys, but it was not leading to um like insight, or to it was maybe leading to some insight around that. I was sort of like, oh, like, am I supposed to be able to go into my own my own stuff? But even though it involved insight, it didn't help me to grow in the way that I needed to, in that sense. So I do see there's kind of like yeah, to me, there's a way of going and going and going into these journeys without with still bypassing the actual puzzle piece that you need to work on, that can sometimes be, then once you discover that puzzle piece, it can be the work of your lifetime,
Absolutely. Yes.
and life gives us so many chances. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely know that for me, where all of my psychedelic assisted psychotherapy experiences led me, and I obviously can't say, and you've heard me say this before, I can't say like, oh, I wish I didn't do them, because I don't know who I would be or what my life would look like. But I can also definitely see that all of that work was leading me to just really learning how to be comfortable in the discomfort
Yeah.
of just human reality, nothing exciting going on, getting
Yeah.
comfortable with the mundane,
Yeah.
grieving my own past, just the complete simplicity. And I know for myself, psychedelics kind of took a little ride on the fantasy world of big feelings and cathartic releases and all of those pieces, which is
Yeah.
why I would love to just spend some time talking to you about how psychedelics became so well known, and in many ways kind of presented as a panacea, or like the cure all, um, for specifically post traumatic stress disorder, but a lot of other mental health disorders now too. They're the ketamine for depression or ketamine for eating disorders. Um, if you see them as more effective, or and how the role of the body plays into those treatment protocols, um, if you see a genuine link there, or if you're skeptical.
Yeah, well, there's so much I could say on that one question, because I have a lot of like, yeah, I have a lot of critique of the psychedelic world in general, and a lot of critique of some of the underground work that goes on. And I'll say in that, what I think a big part of that is that psychedelics can open whatever kind of tendency we might have to idealize or to, aggrandize, all of that can kind of open. So I feel that we sometimes have tendencies to and it's very normal. Like, again, it's like a human experience often, um, especially before doing that kind of deeper, like relational work over time. It can be so normal to kind of like idealize someone as a superior being. We see it like so often happening in just in general in religion and these things. We can see that the people often have a hard time kind of owning their own wisdom and developing themselves in that way. So often, if especially if a parent has sort of come in with this authority of like, you're going to listen to me, whatever the energy was of that regard of child and parent, some of that can leave a person feeling quite doubtful of themselves. And so it's very, very common to sort of like, project someone as, whether it's the maestro or the, the therapist or whoever it is. We have this tendency to look outside of ourselves and go, okay, they have all the answers. And so that roller coaster ride of realizing that, oh, we really have this tendency to kind of like look outside and see somebody as either like, project that they're either amazing, they have all the answers, like they're the ones who are telling us to do this thing, or go judge them and just any parts that we don't like about ourselves, see that this person's not good enough because of this or this. So much of that goes on in the psychedelic world. Now, these journeys that I sat, they're different because I would say, number one, you're actually working with any projection that comes up. And again, you have to be doing your own work to work skillfully with that, because, a lot of people will, lose their center, and they might, in the prep, you start to get a sense of like, let's say somebody's coming in. I mean, that's a big red flag for me. If somebody sees psilocybin as a panacea, I'm starting out right away. It's kind of a funny job because the way I was finding it going was that because of all this exciting information in the news about, microdosing and how magical it can be with, anxiety, or with, you don't hear it as much relating to PTSD per se, but a lot around depression, a lot around things with, sometimes people are using microdosing to lose weight, to try and shift their habits, their exercise or their food habits, all that stuff. So people come in with this really excited idea about it. And a lot of my job is like in the prep is like, all right, let's see if we can be more like be realistic about what this offers, because the idea is that, and microdosing is, people can, that's not what this is, this therapeutic work. So people can choose to explore that if they'd like. But when it comes to these journeys, the idea is that you wouldn't necessarily need to keep taking a substance, because if you have this kind of opening where you realize more of yourself, and then you realize, oh, okay, I've got a lifetime to tap into that in a day-to-day way, even just embracing, as you said, the mundane life, but with this new bit of sense of like a little more hope, or a little bit more of a sense of, liking myself, like just growing into, like letting go, kind of shedding the shame stuff, like old snake skins in a way. Then you're realizing, oh, okay, I'm just growing more into wholeness. And that's very different from the ecstatic heights that you might originally hit. Jack Kornfield has that book, After the Ecstasy of the Laundry, which he's talking about a meditation retreat kind of integration piece, but it's very similar. It's this idea that, okay, in truth, it's just about being a little less defended in life, a little more secure in ourselves, a little less afraid.
How do you really work with someone to set those expectations when there is such a presentation of psychedelics being a cure-all, but also many times psychedelics come with this belief or persona, like if I do them, then I'm like fully healed and I'm like enlightened and I'm like all the things that I don't think I already am. How do you really break down those expectations? Because even if we do it intellectually, I know that they can still be held unconsciously in the body.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is a tricky, this is a great question, because it really is a tricky thing. I I think there's so much going on that's really unconscious in the psychedelic world. So I think that whole piece around, it's even tricky to say, oh, well, I'm not the therapist, I'm doing harm reduction. And I see the side of that, which is like, it makes sense, because you're saying it's better to have someone trained there at a person's side who's already got the medicine, who's already doing the journey. Of course, it's better to have some like a good therapist who can provide that kind of dynamic interpersonal connection and safety. But there's also this piece where the actual job of the therapist straight away needs to be to say, look, like, here are the adverse reactions, here are the risks. And I think that's the most, like, one of the most important pieces to really start with. So you're kind of saying, okay, look, like, with the research, it shows that the research at Johns Hopkins shows that about 30% of people at some point in their journey have high anxiety. So you're starting there and saying, look, panic and fear reactions on a journey are not uncommon. And then you're also looking at some of the concerns around exacerbation or precipitation of like psychiatric conditions. You're kind of also looking at the fact that, you know, a journey might sound like if you're looking up, say, something like, oh, okay, there are these mystical experiences. Well, some people hit those mystical experiences, particularly with a high dose, or they seem to be more common at a higher, a higher dose of psilocybin. But, you know, you're also looking at nausea, you're looking at anxiety, you're looking at like, a really like, probably a sleep. So for some people, a sleepless night, insomnia. For some people, like the next day, they have a brutal headache. So we're looking at things that might affect people's lives if they're trying to, they're kind of coming in to get better, but you have to like really let them know that, hey, this is a big thing and your life needs to also be able to withstand some disruption in order to get the gains in the first place.
What you're speaking to me, at least, like really sounds like grounding those expectations in a really clear way. But also, you touched in just briefly on bringing in the awareness that when you go into your body, you take a psychedelic, whatever that will be. Yes, there's this opportunity for peak magical experiences where you have trauma releases and unpack a whole bunch of childhood trauma, whatever that may be. But in that, you also have the potential to touch into and really embody some of your deepest pain. And I feel like that piece of the narrative of
Yeah.
psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is not very sexy, just to be, it's
Yeah.
not sexy, but it's also what makes it so healing. And I would love to hear from you how you kind of hold that piece oftentimes doesn't make it into the marketing.
Absolutely. Well, it kind of makes me think about how, like, think about love, right? Like, think about romantic love and how we have this idea of just like, I'm going to be maybe whisked away, all these ideas that I'm going to find just the right person who's going to make everything easier is the idea. And
Mhm.
that same attachment story will be projected into the psychedelics. So it can be this hope of like, oh, this thing's going to change everything. It's going to be this, this kind of one and done, like this opening that, yeah, in some ways it can be an opening that changes everything. But if we think about the example of falling in love, ultimately you have to work toward that everyday dynamic where, some things you're really not going to like about the other person, some things you'll be able to, let go, but it'll feel really kind of neutral. It's, there's times of celibacy and even in partnerships. And these days, people can't hold that, even that idea of like, oh, there's going to be times where maybe one person or both people, like people aren't feeling like they want to be sexual with each other, for example. I see that same thing in psychedelics that like, so then the new idea is kind of like, okay, I need to trade this in, then something's not right.
Yeah.
Like our relationship's not right. So we need to open it up. We need to, try something different. We need to separate whatever it is. And absolutely there's like all those things have value and, in the right situations. And there's like, if that's genuinely where people get to, that could be important to be able to feel that freedom. But I'm really pointing out that this attitude of kind of consumerism towards something like a psychedelic experience, it doesn't really work, because just like a relationship, like, we have to put that work in for it to ultimately improve the richness of our life. But
Absolutely.
yeah,
I
yeah,
do, when I look at my experiences most recently, like in the past, like 2, 3 years, of which there's
It's been quite minimal. It's not really a big part of my identity. It's not something I talk about. I don't even put it on my CV. Like I've actually removed it. I'm like, I don't want anyone to know I used to do research or work in that area. But I think now of these experiences, and they're so profoundly healing and beautiful and embodied and full of love in comparison to when I was showing up to those substances and experiences in such a way where I really believed that they would heal me. And what they did actually was just really get me in contact with my most like wounded, unprocessed,
Yeah.
unknown parts of self. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, I wasn't with practitioners that offered integration to a standard that I feel was safe or appropriate.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that just kind of perpetuated then, these really wounded, childlike, unknown parts to kind of take over the show for a little while. And I would love to hear from you how you kind of discern um, with a client when you're like, okay, are they ready? Are they not ready? What type of integration? If they're not ready, can I offer them to make sure we put them all back together?
Yeah.
Because I know I'm not the only person who's taken a psychedelic and then been like, oh my God, what have I done?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can relate to that too, speaking back to those experiences in Peru in 2015 where I I opened so much and none of it fit my worldview, right? Like we're
Mm.
we're coming from the West, we're trying to the degree that I thought I had an open mind, it was like really almost unsettling to try to make sense of what I actually connected to. Ultimately, I found a nice frame of it being life force, and the more I can hold the container for myself, the more I can feel it as okay. It's not, you don't have to understand, right? Because you even the integrations at ayahuasca ceremonies also you're kind of hearing people come through it and going, yeah, so I just got in touch with this past life, and like I was a burning witch and all this stuff, and you're like, okay, but what is this about? Like what?
Yes.
There's like a real lack sometimes of meaning that actually applies to your life. And that's how things can get when, yeah, things start to open and open, open, but that like expansive openness and vastness, like it's not held by like the depths, like we're not holding it
Mhm.
by growing deeper into who we are, even in our personality, our assumptions, our like, yeah, our frame for the world. So it's wild because I think what I've realized is that the work itself, like you ask a great question because what I start with is in my mind, I always start with the fact that I feel most comfortable sitting for someone who has a really deep relationship with a good therapist.
Mm.
And,
Yeah.
you can tell, you can get an idea as you're speaking with someone what the quality of their insights are and whether they're actually integrating that into their lives.
Yes.
Yeah, so that helps a lot because that gives me a big sense of relief. Like, okay, this is gonna be useful, right?
Mhm.
Because yeah, as you said, like especially when people, so let's say on a journey, just to speak to that piece you mentioned about trauma, on a journey, people might come up against some really painful pieces. Let's say they even have a vision of an abuser, right? Well, they need integration on that. They need to be able to now do the work, which is that therapeutic work of being able to gain their sense of empowerment again, which is that trust that we can put on the brakes or the gas on things in life, and on our feelings. So in that case, you would be working with them to maybe, like, I would have them draw an image, and then in our therapy there's some nice practices of, okay, what if we put some bars on that, what if we put a square, what would the frame look like? Maybe it's a really thick frame, we might fold it up into something really tiny and we might put it in like the file cabinet, for example, and they'll be able to come back on the next session because you're letting them
Mm.
know, what, we can't just repress this, we can't just actually unfortunately, like, just release and go, oh yeah, I'm just letting this go. No, this is going to be now ongoing therapeutic work to be able to touch back into that and see, okay, where am I at with that image? Now maybe the image has changed because maybe
Mhm.
the more people trust that they can put the brakes on and not go into things that they aren't ready to look at, that all parts of them, I guess I should say, aren't ready to look at, because there can be an ego part, but I think all parts need to sort of feel safe enough first to even open into some of that. So yeah,
I
it's a
loved
lot.
one thing you said there, like, what is it all for? That question really like came out to me of like, what are
Yeah.
we doing this? What is the intention? What
Yeah.
are we hoping to gain? And
Yeah.
why I even wanted to bring you on here is because what I ended up getting at the end of my, little journey through the psychedelic world was, the answer to that why was connection to my body. And
Yeah.
even though there's a lot of stuff that was quite harmful, because I didn't have appropriate integration and ended up, fumbling around relationships with people who kind of had the same qualities of, men who'd been very abusive to me and ended up repeating a lot of stuff and had a lot of pain, it did connect me to my body in a way that I had never had before. And I feel like in the psychedelic conversation, as we've kind of touched on, there's a lot of psychedelics being a panacea or it's going to heal all and la di da. And, maybe it will for some, maybe not so
Yeah.
much. One thing that has felt really true for me is that it's connected me to my body. And that piece I feel like is often missed from the conversation. And I
Yeah.
would love to hear just even a little bit more from you
Yeah.
around how maybe it's supported you in connecting to your own body, if those are specific moments,
Yeah.
or since you have worked professionally with people in the Schedule 56, if there's someone that comes to your mind so that when we say like psychedelics can be a portal to embodiment,
Yeah.
people have an idea of what that really means.
Yeah. Oh, that's a beautiful question. Yeah, I think of how when, in a way, when people are going to do this work, it really helps if they have that understanding that they are both surrendering to themselves in the
Mhm.
journey, and they are that they have the power when it comes to anything. Like to me, it's like on journey day, how close do you want me to sit, before we get
Mhm.
going? Um, does today still feel like the day for this, right? It's kind of strange work because as therapists we're used to a lot of structure, but I feel just that this work has to be a lot more intuitive, and like you have to allow people to have a process that usually they will want to go forward, but you have to give them that freedom to use their intuition. And
Mhm.
so it's just ever more important because of that layer where, as you said, they might be touching into things in the body that, yeah, that like are very painful. And so then it's like, okay, are we prepared for this? Do we know that this is what's really going to happen, is that
Yeah.
like things will wake up? And yeah, I can give you an example. A personal one is, I think, part of the reason why I've been really interested in sex therapy is because I didn't, just like everyone else, our sex therapy education was so much about like probably more like the don't do this and don't do that. So it's a lot more of the yeah, kind of, yeah, the warnings than it really was about ever teaching any pleasure. And when I started working with Safe Teen, I was in my 20s and I got to go to high schools and share with them that, hey, guess what? Like women have a sexual energy, like we have a
Mhm.
powerful life force. And as I shared that with them, I would realize every time again and again, like, wow, I really was like unaware of how out of touch I was in that way. Like my
Mhm.
body in a way had been a bit like kind of like you don't, even we talk about it even in meditation, how no one's really invited to feel below the belly button. It's like my personality is supposed to start at my belly. And so it's kind of interesting because it's like being able to recognize that, oh, there were ways that being in my whole body while being around others felt that it was somehow a threat or something.
Yeah.
And psychedelics helped me to it just unabashedly just get really in touch with that vital life force that moves through our whole body, and
Mhm.
just to reconnect with that in a way that was really safe and really beautiful. And that's where I'd say I had a lot of healing, and that it was a very embodied process, even, you know, even in the context of that, as much as I can say those
Yeah.
challenges with the psychological development that didn't quite get there with the ayahuasca journeys,
Yeah.
the embodiment happened.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
As you were saying that, you planted a little seed of an idea I'll have to keep exploring because I have, um, yeah, I mean, maybe I'll just own a little bit of judgment, or there are some judgments around how psychedelics took me into some of like my deepest wounding, but also, you know, you could argue that it took me into the deepest portal of embodiment because those experiences lived in my body, the memory of what happened. And, I got a little too close to contact with them and they kind of took over my adult functioning personality in many ways. But they did connect me to my body. And in some ways, when you take a psychedelic, it's buyer beware. Like, how deep are you going to go?
Yeah. Well, it sounds like, yeah, like it makes me think as you're saying you did get in touch with your body. And it sounds like what happened was it was like just so much, like it was
Mhm.
so much to process. And like, yeah, the therapy, that hour session naturally creates this kind of container
Yes.
of, yeah, dropping in like just sometimes just
Mhm.
a little bit, or yeah, sometimes a little bit more. But yeah, I appreciate doing analysis where it's not body centered. Sometimes that's a nice relief when you're just not
Yeah,
feeling like
I
opening up.
know.
It's such a shift from, yeah, maybe what we're used to in a more, yeah, somatic.
Totally.
Yeah.
I think it's I always kind of giggle myself to myself when I see the hype around psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. And obviously I'm speaking, with hindsight because I engaged a lot for a significant amount of time, but I giggle to myself because as much of psychoanalysis has a reputation for being a little rigid and a little in the
Yeah.
head and like very like practical, I'm like, I have gotten the most intimate relationship with myself and my body through this
Yeah.
practice that
Yeah.
everyone kind of pushes away as like
Yeah.
stuffy and old school. And I'm just like, no, it's OG. Like it's the real deal. Like, you want to change your life? Show up to psychoanalysis
I
regularly.
I agree. I so agree because it's like it's funny, right? Because it's like, yeah, you're not speaking directly about that kind of stream of vitality necessarily, but you're
No.
you're looking right at the blocks. You're looking right at the
Yes.
things, yeah, that are getting in your way. And isn't
Totally.
that yeah, that and at a way that your consciousness can obviously process it. Again, I
Yeah.
love dream work because that's also included there in psychoanalysis and Jungian analysis. And it is like at the pace, like your body's giving you those dreams. So it's the pace that
Mhm.
you can obviously receive and process that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that you honor as well. Sometimes getting blasted into the body is what someone needs, and there's a time and a place
Yeah,
for
absolutely.
absolutely everything. I
Yeah.
would love to hear from you if there's any piece around psychedelic assisted psychotherapy or psilocybin that you would like to share with those who are listening that we didn't get to today.
Well, I think, yeah, since we started talking a little bit about those Section 56 exemptions, and you did ask at one point, and then I went into a personal example instead of the other example that's coming to mind there. But I will say, like when we were doing those high dose journeys, those 5 gram journeys that were really chosen because they were end of life journeys, and people were saying,
Mhm.
yeah, I want that hero's dose. I want to see what is beyond this life. And I will say they were so powerful because probably in part those people had done tons of psychotherapy. One of them that I sat, the man, and this is all they share openly in the news and such. And he had been a psychotherapist himself. And so it was so powerful to have that integration for myself because, yeah, sitting journeys maybe in circles where people have various degrees of practice with that kind of depth. When I sat those journeys, they were so touching. They just melted my heart. I went to this man's house in the week following his journey, and he had been sitting there like in his rocking chair, looking out at the ocean, just integrating everything that had happened. And he was still so much in touch with that space, which made me then realize, oh, this is a space, this is a state in the mind. We can access this. Like he's still in the journey. And whenever you have an insight like that in a really tangible way, it helps, I find, for understanding this whole thing that like life is the journey.
Yeah.
So I was even able to share with him, like when I had sat at the deaths of my grandparents, like my two of my grandparents, well, actually three, and then my mother-in-law's death. When I sat there in those moments where they were taking their last breaths, I felt this sense of like, this is it. Like, you can pay thousands of dollars for an ayahuasca journey, but isn't the point to be present in your life, like to be present with what
Mhm.
is here? And life gives us those opportunities, whether
Yeah.
it's sitting in a death or a birth or having a birth through your body, like those experiences are the same portal, right? But they're actually that opportunity to, like, you don't have the projection onto something happened to me so
Yeah.
much, right? Like a substance did this to me. You have more of an experience of like, whoa, okay, so all of life, like this is happening all the time. There's more and more to attune to in this moment, in my body, and in the
Mm.
space I'm in and relationally. So
Yeah.
yeah,
I love that piece. Psychedelics can remove the stories that disconnect us from the present moment in our bodies, but the present moment in our body and all that it's processing is always there. It's just like, can we release the mind enough to actually be in the journey that is life? And I love how you pulled apart just those different portals and different avenues that all call us to be present in different ways. Um,
exactly.
Thank you so much for spending more time with us and getting to focus specifically on psychedelic assisted psychotherapy and the work that you do. Um, Everyone will be able to find you. All your notes will be below. Is there anything else before we close for today?
Well, I'll just say thank you as well. I really appreciate it. I always love when people can be brave enough to be critical of these things that can be on trend. And so I love these conversations. It was so rich. And yeah, and there are a few podcast episodes. We mentioned in the last one that I have the Earth Priestess podcast, and there are a couple on there around this kind of stuff as well. So people
Mm.
might feel free to check that out.
Yeah, we can link that in. Thank you so much, Angela.
Thanks, Ailey.
If you found value in this episode, it would mean so much to me for you to share the podcast with friends, a loved one, or on your social platforms. If you have the time, please rate and review the podcast so that this podcast reaches a larger audience and can inspire more and more humans to connect to their bodies too. Thank you for being here and nurturing the relationship you have with your very own body.